Never go to sea. On a sparkling winter's day in 1826, a young Englishwoman named Anne Saunders boarded a vessel that was sailing from New Brunswick in Canada to Liverpool. She was looking forward to the Atlantic voyage. The outward journey had been a delight, and the return seemed set to be the same. We set sail, she later wrote, with a favourable wind and the prospect and joyful expectations of an expeditious passage. There were 21 people on board, including Anne's close friend, Mrs. Kendall, the wife of the captain. The Francis Mary had been at sea for almost 3 weeks, when, on the first day of February, she was hit by a ferocious storm. About noon, our vessel was struck by a tremendous sea, which swept from her decks almost every movable object. Anne looked on helpless as one of the mariners was washed overboard. He was extremely fortunate to be plucked from the water by his comrades. Worse was to come. As the storm increased in intensity, it lashed at the timbers and pitched the vessel from peak to trough. Anne watched in terror as a monstrous wave emerged from nowhere, slamming against the side of the vessel and striking with such force that it ripped away a part of the hull. Water gushed into the hold, flooding the storage areas and threatening to drag the ship down. The Francis Mary was already listing heavily when another huge wave struck the vessel and flipped her upwards through 45 degrees. Everyone on board clung to the rigging and slowly pulled themselves up towards the forecastle, the only part of the ship that remained above the waterline. Still, she didn't sink. Indeed, she had stabilized at an erratic angle, in the water heaving up and down in the heavy swell. Several of her crew now made a desperate attempt to descend into the waterlogged interior and rescue whatever provisions they could. At great risk to their lives, they clambered below decks and managed to drag out 50 pounds of bread and biscuit, along with a few pounds of cheese. It was precious little sustenance for everyone on board, especially as they were exposed to the full fury of an Atlantic winter. It was not long before they began to die. James Clark was the first to succumb. He breathed his last on the 12th of February, and his body was hurled overboard. Next to die was John Wilson. His death coincided with the last of the biscuit rations being consumed. After a brisk debate, the crew and passengers took the momentous decision to keep themselves alive by eating him. Anne Saunders watched stoically as Wilson's corpse was roughly dismembered and then chopped into manageable chunks. It was cut into slices, then washed in salt water, and after being exposed to and dried a little in the sun, was apportioned to each of the miserable survivors. Anne was of genteel disposition and could not bring herself to eat human flesh. She refused to take her portion, but after 24 hours of further starvation, she was compelled by hunger to follow their example. She noticed that the group act of cannibalism changed the dynamics of life aboard the stricken vessel. We eyed each other with mournful and melancholy looks, she said. Each person had become a potential meal. Men now began to die every day. When Sailor Moore succumbed to exposure, they feasted on his liver and heart. Henry David and John Jones were the next to expire, followed by several of the cabin boys. One of them died raving mad, crying out lamentably. All were dismembered and consumed by the surviving crew. Several barrels of water had been rescued in the aftermath of the storm. These now ran dry, driving those on board to the melancholy, distressful, horrid act to procure of their blood, of cutting the throats of their deceased companions a moment after the breath of life had left their bodies. Miss Saunders watched aghast as her female companion, Mrs. Kendall, munched through the brains of one of the seamen. When the last morsel was finished, she turned to the others with dripping fingers and declared it the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. The next death weighed particularly heavily on young Anne. James Freer was a youthful admirer of hers, one who had plucked up the courage to propose marriage in the terrible days that followed the storm. Anne had accepted without hesitation, and promised to tie the knot as soon as they had reached England. Now, as young James slipped from unconsciousness into death, she had little choice but to eat him. She described herself as being so far reduced by hunger and thirst that she was obliged to suck the blood as it oozed half congealed from the wound inflicted upon his lifeless body. Several more of the crew expired in the days that followed Frere's death, and soon there were only 6 people left alive. When a vessel was finally sighted on the horizon, it was the HMS Blonde. All 6 were on the verge of death. The captain of the Blonde was horrified to discover that those aboard the Francis Mary had kept themselves alive by gorging on their crewmates. He was even more appalled to discover that the ship's ropes were festooned with thin slices of human flesh left to dry in the stiff sea breeze. Yet he took pity on the gaunt survivors and rescued them from their waterlogged vessel. The blonde finally arrived in England in April 1826 with Anne and 5 others. Although deeply shaken by her ordeal, Anne was relieved to have survived a voyage that had killed 15 of her travelling companions, and she remained surprisingly philosophical about having eaten her fiancé. I think that I witnessed more of the heavy judgments and afflictions of this world than any other of its female inhabitants, she said. Grim and gruesome, and it is one of the many fascinating stories in this book. Fascinating Footnotes from History by Giles Milton, and it is the first book I'm going to talk about in this new segment of Off the Shelf, where there'll be relatively short videos. Rather than doing a full shelf tour, I thought I would just pick a book at random and talk a little bit about it. So you've heard one of the stories in there. It is jam-packed full of wonderful little tidbits and morsels, probably a bad choice of words given what we've just read, but let me just read the inside flap to you. Giles Milton is a master of historical narrative. In his characteristically engaging prose, Fascinating Footnotes from History details 100 of the quirkiest historical nuggets, eye-stretching stories that read like fiction but are 100% fact. And I would just like to say that is really true of Giles Milton as well. He's one of my favourite authors. I think he's a fantastic writer of the historical narrative. I have enjoyed every single one of his books. And if you haven't read him and you enjoy history, especially slightly quirky or little lesser known history, then I suggest you go out and read some Giles Milton. Included in this edition, it says there is Hiro Onoda, the lone Japanese soldier still fighting the Second World War in 1974. Agatha Christie, who mysteriously disappeared for 11 days in 1926. And Werner Franz, the cabin boy on the Hindenburg, who lived to tell the tale when it was engulfed in flames in 1937. Fascinating Footnotes from History also reveals who ate the last dodo, who really killed Rasputin, and why Sergeant Stubby had 4 legs. Peopled with a gallery of spies, rogues, cannibals, adventurers, and slaves, and spanning 20 centuries and 6 continents, Giles Milton's impeccably researched footnotes shed light on some of the most infamous stories and the most flamboyant and colourful characters and animals from history. So yeah, there you go. It is really good fun. Probably, it might not be a book you read in one go, but it's certainly something you would like to dip in and out of, as I have from time to time, although I believe I've read every story in there by now. And he is really fantastic. I will probably talk about some of his other books in later videos. So yeah, this is Fascinating Footnotes from History, and this is a book that is off my shelf. So from me, Mark, and Elvis, who's not around at the moment, he's in another room, we wish you a fantastic rest of your day, and we will see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.